Akwesasne, and welcome to the next installment of the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators 2020 webinar series. Today's webinar is on the Tribal Adaptation Menu and building climate resilience through Indigenous knowledge. And we're fortunate today to have not one, but three distinguished presenters. Sarah Smith is the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison at the College of Menominee and a part of the Sustainable Development Institute. She's a direct descendant of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and holds a bachelor's degree of science in biology, ecology, and conservation, and First Nation studies from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, as well as a master's of science degree in ecology from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. We also have with us today Hannah Panci, who is a scientist in the Climate Change Program at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, where she uses both traditional knowledge and mainstream science in the climate adaptation world. Her primary projects at the Greater Lakes Institute of Fish and Wildlife Conservation include a phenology study, seed bank project, and a climate change vulnerability and assessment. We also have Robert Croll, who is a policy analyst for the Division of Intergovernmental Affairs at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, where he coordinates the climate change program and provides policy analysis and operational experience to the Conservation Enforcement Division. Prior to being there, Rob spent nearly 20 years as a conservation officer with the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, Bureau of Law Enforcement, retiring at the rank of captain. His educational background includes a BS in Environmental Studies from Northland College and a Master of Environmental Law and Policy from Vermont Law School. Before we begin, I have a couple of quick announcements. For those of you who weren't at our last webinar, a reminder, we've set the dates for the TAP 2021 conference. We're going to have a very large multi-day event on September 21st through September 24th, 2021. It'll be held at the Uchee Butterfly Farm in Bixby, Oklahoma. We also have a lot of travel scholarship funding available because everything was canceled this year, and we're hoping to get participation from tribes all over Oklahoma, as well as many tribes as possible from across the country. Our new website, tribalallianceforpollinators.com, will have details about the conference posted soon, and the website will also post a recording of today's webinar after we're done and has links to recordings of our past webinars. We'll be taking questions today at the end of the webinar, and you can type them into the little question box on your webinar dashboard. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters.
Siku Skwapaku, Sarah Smith Yungiats. What I just yo, Onioteaga ni iyo kale wakwaho ni wagadaloda. So hello everyone and good morning. My name is Sarah Smith, and I'm from the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin. And like Jean said, I'm the Midwest Tribal Resilience Liaison with the College of Menominee Nation and also working with the Northeast and Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Centers. And good morning.
Bonjour, everybody. Hannah Indigenous, Ironwood and Dunjba, Queen and Dudu Damasi. My name is Hannah Panci, and I'm a scientist in the Climate Change Program at the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. Welcome, everybody.
Bonjour, Niji Bimadazi, Rob Indigenous, Queen and Damasi, Philadelphia and Dunjba, Anishinaabe Aki, and Glyphwick and Denoki. My name's Rob Croll. I'm the Climate Change Program Coordinator for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. I'm very happy to be here today. Before we move on, I just want to say a quick word about language. Language is the foundation of culture. And the idea behind our Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu is that it's climate adaptation, that it's culturally appropriate and using culture and language and traditional activities as climate adaptation tactics. So Hannah and I, who are not tribal members, introduce ourselves in the language because we know that there are concepts there that go beyond just the English introduction of, hi, my name's Rob and I work for Glyphwick. Throughout the creation of the menu, and Sarah will talk a little bit about this further on, what we found was that there were a lot of concepts in English that didn't translate themselves well into the primary languages of the people that we work for, the Ojibwe people, the Menominee people, Sarah's Oneida relatives in Wisconsin. And so what we had to do in a lot of cases was go to language speakers and go to elders with concepts that we had, and they would then give us language to use that we would then have to translate back into English. And that's actually part of the title for the menu. Debugging Jigadeg Anishinaabe Ejitoad loosely translates to doing something the Anishinaabe way. Anishinaabe refers to original people, so all of the indigenous people in this land. And the concept then is doing something the original way, going back to those old original teachings. Next slide, Sarah, please. So this is our Tribal Adaptation Menu team. There are quite a few of us. I'm going to turn my camera off now because sometimes I lose signal. So you can see there are quite a few of us, and we represent a lot of different entities. There are federal agencies on here, academia, tribes, intertribal entities. And our team included tribal members, tribal harvesters and gatherers who are still out on the land practicing those traditional subsistence activities, scientists, policy people, language speakers, tribal employees, intertribal employees, and everybody brought different life experiences, different perspectives and values to the table, both personal and institutional. And in this consensus-driven process, all of these things were valuable and valid. Next slide. So this is a photograph of part of our team back in 2019, receiving the Climate Adaptation Leadership Award. This is an award presented by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and recognizes excellence in climate adaptation for natural resources, which is kind of ironic because natural resources is a very Western concept that is applied to a different cultural perspective when we're thinking about how Native people think about natural resources. So initially we talk about climate change and tribes, and there are a lot of different effects and impacts of climate change. In this case, this is a campground at the Bay Mills Indian community on the shores of Lake Superior. As you can see, there is a lot of shoreline erosion being caused by wind and storm events. When we think about how to adapt to this climate change, the solution here is fairly simple. We retreat, we move the campground a little further inland, and that's exactly what the community did. But how do we apply this to cultural resources? And that's the point of the menu. These photographs are of a roadway in the Bad River Reservation in northern Wisconsin, just around the corner from my house. It's where our Glyphwick offices are. This is a flood that happened in 2016 in a 500-year storm. That was the third one we'd had in about 10 years. In this case, the reservation was cut off, and there were people that had to be helicoptered in and out for medical procedures, kidney dialysis, things like that. And we know that in the United States, there are 574 federally recognized tribes and tribal groups, 60 state recognized tribes, and countless tribes that have been disenfranchised by government policy and government action. Each of them have their own climate change story to tell. And when I get asked, how is climate change affecting Native communities? I tell people, you need to go ask them. So we talked about natural resources and how the perspective is different. From the Western perspective, natural resources are something to be used and to be monetized often. But from the perspective that we used in the menu, the more indigenous perspective, these beings are our relatives and our teachers. And climate change impacts to them also impact culture. So this is a graphic from Glyphwick's Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment, showing the relative vulnerability of some of our culturally important plant and animal relatives. And I won't go through all of them, but you can kind of see how some of the more vulnerable beings are also some of the more culturally important. So next. So this is another piece from our vulnerability assessment, talking about how Menominee or wild rice can be impacted by climate change. Menominee is a being gifted to the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe people, and the prophecy that inspired their migration story from the East Coast to where they live now in the Great Lakes region. And rice, Menominee, is a being that's so integral to culture that tribal members have said its loss from their lands is an existential threat to their culture and their worldview as Anishinaabe people. And Menominee is also about as vulnerable to climate change as a being can be. Affected by land use, limited dispersal ability to adapt to cool environments and ice cover and snow cover, has particular hydrological requirements. And all of these things are going to be affected by the changing climate up here in the North Woods, when we're getting warmer summers and less warm winters and more storms and more variability in our precipitation. Next. So we recognize that culturally important beings are moving or shifting ranges or disappearing due to climate change, and that tribal homelands, reservations, and treaty ceded territories are fixed in place, and that the loss of access to these culturally important beings and the reciprocal relationships that people have had with them since time immemorial is an existential threat to Indigenous culture and community. So to adapt to climate change, actions must be culturally appropriate and supported by the community.
Okay, and this is Hannah. I'll take over for a little bit. And I have my toddler Soren with me in the background, who's actually in the picture too. But so if you hear him, sorry about that. Go ahead. You can go back to this slide before Sarah. Yeah. So with all of that background, we need to talk about what is the tool that we're talking about. And so we needed something that would allow tribes and Indigenous people to do culturally appropriate climate adaptation. And so it just so happened that it fit into this framework of the adaptation menus. And they're about as complex as that poster is showing, which is extremely complex. No, just kidding. We designed them to be very simple tools that anybody can use. So go ahead. So we designed it as a part of together with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, who has a forest adaptation resources workbook, and they have designed these adaptation menus for other ecosystems. So they have some for forests, some for agriculture, forested watersheds. Hold on just a second. And a variety of different ecosystems. But there wasn't anything specifically tailored for tribes, so that's where we came in. We took this approach that they had already used with this adaptation workbook, and we plugged in the Tribal Adaptation Menu into that adaptation workbook. So the workbooks are designed for anybody to use, so anybody that has some land that they're thinking about goals and objectives on that land and thinking about climate adaptation. The workbook doesn't make any recommendations, so the users bring your own values, your own goals and objectives to it. And just to note that there is an online version too. Okay, so we can't fix that right now, but we can fix it later. So the adaptation workbook, I can't do that right now. Can you go get your rigs and go play in the okay. So the workbook has 5 components to it, which you can see on the screen. And you'll see they're organized in a circle so that it just feeds right back into itself when you're done. So it very clearly helps anyone who comes to this process define your management objectives. You know, that can be anything. Users can, you know, bring their own objectives, their own values to this. So then you look at assessing climate impacts. So what, you know, we have a lot of ideas of what will happen across the country in different regions, but this is where you can plug in what will happen in your particular region. What are climate impacts that are unique to your place that'll make a difference in what actions you choose? So you look at objectives. What are your climate impacts? Given those climate impacts, do you need to maybe rethink your management objectives? If there's something, you know, if you're expecting a lot of severe storms in your area and you have a plant that's maybe prone to uprooting when you have a lot of flooding, maybe you might need to rethink your objectives about keeping that plant on the landscape, something like that. So given those challenges, do you need to rethink your objectives? And then what adaptation approaches do you need to take? And this is where the menu comes in. So we plug in the menu in step 4, and we'll get into it in a little bit in terms of the details. But what adaptation approaches do you want to take? And then when you actually implement them, then there's the monitoring step, which, you know, you pick out adaptation approaches, you're actually doing management or actions on the landscape. So were they effective? Did they help you achieve your goals? And then if yes, you know, continue what you're doing. And if no, you can start back at step 1 with defining your management objectives again, given your monitoring. So the adaptation menus are just like they sound. They're menus. They're organized into different categories, you know, just like a menu at a restaurant. So here you have, you know, this is the brunch menu, but then within that there's classics, sides, pasta, and the adaptation menus are organized that same way. So you might end up in one particular category, and you might pick actions from, you know, all of those different categories, or from that one particular category. Or you might choose something from different categories. And then we have a note that sometimes there are opposing ideas, and that's intentional. So what's right for one group or one person might not be right for another group. And so some ideas might not go together, but they're all included in the menu because each group will pick different adaptation actions. So go ahead. So just, yeah, think of this diagram. Oh. Yeah, so think of this diagram as that same menu structure. So option, that's kind of just a general thinking. So you'll see these words again. We have strategies, approaches, tactics, and then action. That's the actual what are you going to do on the landscape. And think of those as just menu items that you can select during this workbook process. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so the reason these adaptation menus are so successful, there's a few of them, but the first one is that they connect broad ideas to specific actions. So you might think, I kind of want to resist climate change in this area. Maybe this is an area that's going to experience less warming, fewer climate impacts. So maybe I can kind of keep things the way they are at the moment, minimize change. And so you have this broad idea, well, what does that actually mean? So then you'll narrow your thinking down to a strategy. So you might select strategy 4 from our menu, which is sustain fundamental ecological and cultural functions. So I want the function of the landscape to stay the same. Okay, well, within that, you might choose approach 4.5, revitalizing and maintaining Anishinaabe or cultural use of Ishkode or fire as a stewardship tool. So going back to using fire on the landscape more, maybe that's what you're interested in doing in order to sustain those functions. And so the tactic is the getting down to that specific, what are you going to do on the landscape? And that's using prescribed burns in marsh habitats to encourage young plant communities. And so the tactics are where we have strategies and approaches in the menu, and the tactics are up for you to decide. So those specific things, there's some examples in the menu, but that's where you really get into what are you going to do in your landscape. So it also makes your actions intentional. So if you want to, maybe minimize change, kind of resist climate change, I will do this. And so your thought, the workshop or the adaptation menu gives you a chance to organize your thoughts and make your intent very clear. I would like to do this, so I'm going to do this. And it allows you to communicate your ideas. So by going through this workshop and this adaptation menu process, it allows you to connect all of your thoughts together. I'd like to do this, so this is what I'm actually going to do on the landscape. Oh, I have a little emergency over here. Can one of you take over for just a minute?
Sure, I got it.
Okay.
So the other thing this does is it gives you a written plan that you can then take to superiors or tribal council or local government and say in very clear and succinct way, explain exactly what you want to do on your landscape. Next. It also helps you to boost your creativity. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure process where you can think through a lot of different options and then come up with a really customized plan. And Sarah, I think you're next.
Yep. So the TAM beginnings really started here, which was back in 2017 when NIACS was holding one of their workshops on forested watersheds. And at these workshops, just like our own, groups will bring a project to work on. And so this group, which includes some of our authors on the team, brought a project focused on Menominee wild rice. And throughout the workshop, the tool that they were using with NIACS, which Hannah covered, was really useful, but it was lacking that Indigenous perspective. And so that's where the idea of creating a tribal adaptation menu was created. And so, like Hannah was saying, these adaptation menus have been pretty reflective of Western science for the most part and more resource-centric. And there was this need to create a different menu that's reflective of Indigenous knowledges and this more kin-centric perspective. And so this new tribal adaptation menu was going to be based on decision-making rooted in Indigenous ways and Indigenous knowledges, and engaging those Indigenous sciences. And so the menu was primarily developed to be used in Indigenous communities with tribal natural resource staff and also with non-Indigenous partners. So that could be Forest Service, Department of Natural Resources, partners like that. And this menu is to help bridge communication barriers for those non-tribal partners and organizations who are interested in Indigenous approaches to climate adaptation and their needs and values to the tribal communities that they may be working with or maybe working on ceded lands in that territory. And this menu is also designed to be used across diverse ecosystems, different scales, goals, values, things like that. And so this menu is primarily based on Ojibwe and Menominee perspectives, language, culture, values, and it's intentionally designed to be adaptable by other Indigenous communities as well, allowing them to incorporate their own language, their own culture, and knowledge as well. And so one thing that's unique about this menu is that it starts off with these guiding principles. And when we think about ways to work on the land and with our relatives, we think about the 3 R's: respect, reciprocity, and relationships. And these were used when we were making decisions with our relatives on the landscape and really making sure we gave acknowledgement throughout that process. In today's management and decision making, it's more or less a resource base, a more individualized decision process, unlike what it used to be, which was a communal decision and mainly based on consensus. And so these guiding principles help provide a framework to integrate Indigenous knowledge, culture, and language into that adaptation process. And it helps to include community engagement, this decolonization of scientific research and applications in Indigenous communities, and also on co-managed areas like ceded territories. And so these guiding principles, as well as the menu itself, is adaptable as well. We recognize that not all tribal or Indigenous communities have the same values and culture, and so it's adaptable for Indigenous communities to take and put in their values and language. So in our guiding principles, some of the things we talk about are the importance of human and non-human relationships. So our relatives on the landscape also should be respected, showed reciprocity, and we have that responsibility to do so. It also talks about cultural paradigms, like I said, community engagement and decision making. And then also, how do we end a project and what information is disseminated from that? So really thinking about who owns that knowledge, who holds on to it, what can be shared. There are things sometimes when we're working on a adaptation project that has very sensitive information that may be vital to the project, but not to be shared with the general public. And so it goes through these different principles and how important they are when doing work with tribes. And so I'm just going to go real briefly over a few of the strategies and approaches in the menu. We have a total of 14 strategies, and so it would take a while to go through them, which we do in the workshops. But I'm just going to give you a few examples here today. So looking at the Tribal Adaptation Menu compared to the Forest Adaptation Menu that NIACS created, there are 2 strategies that are very similar, yet they are stated in a different way for different thinking styles for management. And so for the Forest Adaptation Menu, Strategy 9 talks about facilitating community adjustments through species transitions. And the approach is to introduce species that are expected to be adapted to future conditions. And so we see this a lot with shifting species ranges, especially with the changing climate, where species are moving north. So the idea is to introduce species that perhaps are more southern, that are expected to do well in the current location you are. And in the Tribal Adaptation Menu, we have something very similar to that, which is Strategy 11, which is to encourage community adjustments and transition while maintaining reciprocity and balance. And so one of the approaches under that strategy is to seek out and share traditional and cultural knowledge of potential new beings from tribal communities where those beings are native. So this is really looking at, perhaps we do have a southern species that is coming up our way. What are some of the tribal communities who already have that being in their community, and what can we learn from them? And then also thinking about our sisters and brothers to the north. We have the political boundary of the United States and Canada, but we're all on Turtle Island. And so sharing that knowledge with our First Nation relatives up in Canada is also important as well, to learn from each other on these transitions that we're going to be dealing with. And so the first 3 strategies in the adaptation menu are really unique and something that we've put a lot of care and work into. And the first strategy is to consider cultural practices and seek spiritual guidance. So this talks about things such as, consulting cultural leaders, tribal historic preservation officers, understanding the human and landscape history of the community, being mindful and practicing reciprocity with our human relatives and non-human relatives. Strategy 3 is to support tribal engagement. So this could be things like youth programs, monitoring programs, language revitalization. And then strategy 2, which was actually the last strategy we wrote, is to learn through careful and respectful observation. So this is to learn from the beings and natural communities themselves and how they respond to changes over time. A lot of times with Western management, we are so quick to act to manage a landscape that might have had a natural disaster come through, and we want to be able to just, return it to how it was. This strategy is more so, learning from the landscape, how is it responding without us actively doing something. So more so doing something through not doing something. And then I like to point out this approach, 5.2, because it gets brought up very often. And it's to maintain or improve the ability of communities to balance the effects of non-local beings. And I'm still working on my Ojibwe, so I don't want to disrespect the word for trying it right now. But this is talking about invasive species. And we spent a good day just on this strategy because of the term invasive species. And what does that really mean to Indigenous people? These beings, are non-local beings. They're from another place. And when all beings were put on this earth, they were given these original instructions. And so these non-local beings are just doing what they were told through their original instructions. They're just in a place that they don't have those checks and balances like the ones that were there. And so this really shifts people's mindsets on how to maintain or improve these communities that have these non-local beings, and really thinking about, how can we respectfully manage them or use them instead of this war mentality on eradicating them because they might be changing an ecosystem. And I'll turn it over to Rob.
Okay. Sorry about that, everyone in back. So given all of this, we have we introduced the Tribal Adaptation Menu and then putting it to work. For the past couple of years, we've been doing workshops. And these workshops end up being 2.5-day workshops where, people come, stay in the area, and every day we're in a room discussing all of these different concepts and coming up with adaptation plans for each of the projects. About 5 to 6 or 5 to 8 or so people bring projects to the workshop, and then everyone else that comes to the meetings divides up and helps those people with their projects. So you get a diverse set of voices in the room. So far we've had, I think, 5 workshops, and all these dots represent the projects that have come out of those. So they're definitely all across the region, Midwest, Northeast, and then we had one with the Miccosukee tribe in Florida, looking at sea level rise down there on the bottom. So it's definitely a tool that works in different regions and on a lot of different projects. So here's just a visual representation. These are all the people we've had at our 5 workshops. And so, you know, not everyone shown in those pictures brought projects, but all of those projects came from some of the people in those workshops. And those projects are in various states of completion. We have one project that was started at this first workshop, the tribal wetland restoration with the Iowa Tribe of Oklahoma. That's been completed. That was our first fully completed tribal adaptation menu project, which was really cool. So this was a workshop we had in Minnesota, our first test run of the tribal adaptation menu. And we just threw up some text so you could see some examples of the projects that came out of each of those. So the wetland restoration, there was a paper birch habitat and restoration with Glyphwick, and then a forest management, cultural fire, and moose habitat project with the Grand Portage Band. Then we had one in the eastern Upper Peninsula with the Bay Mills tribe, and some of those that came out were the Great Lakes coastal marsh and Menominee restoration, or wild rice restoration, a cedar restoration project, road stream crossings with the Forest Service, and then a leak restoration project. Okay, we had one with the Akwesasne in New York, including emerald ash borer preparation, looking at black ash with the local tribes there, culturally appropriate invasive species control, critical infrastructure planning, and the pictures are showing, you know, during the course of the workshop, we have people make a poster so they can give just a really short overview. Here's goals, objectives, impacts, and given those goals, we have a little bit of a brainstorming session with the whole group. So what adaptation actions can we come up with, and then present what the group has chosen. So that's just one little piece of the workshop. But go ahead. One down in Menominee, sea level rise from Florida, an Indigenous focused Wisconsin master naturalist class. So that one's a little bit of a different perspective, not as much of a ecosystem based project, but we found a way to work through the menu with it. So definitely works for a lot of different projects. And then a cranberry restoration one. And then we just snuck this one at the last minute in March before everything shut down due to COVID. But there was a workshop in northern Wisconsin near our office, 10-year comprehensive plan from the Red Cliff Band, and then an Indigenous food systems project with Glyphwick. And those aren't all the projects, that's just a couple snapshots. But so the workshops, we get everybody involved. You can see some posters in the back with colorful dots, some dot voting activities, and then these guys are presenting a little claymation or clay diagram they've done. So it's definitely like a multimedia process incorporating different senses, and all with the goal of coming up with Indigenous, you know, and culturally appropriate climate adaptation actions. So go ahead. Oh, back to you, Rob.
So this brings us all back to what's next. What's next for us on the TAM team? What's next for the TAM itself? 2020 has been a challenging year. We snuck the Red Cliff workshop in at the very last minute, and literally one of the participants from the Seneca Nation flew back to New York and immediately went into quarantine for 2 weeks because he traveled and his tribal government said he couldn't be out in public. So our author team sat down and talked about this, and we decided that this was a really good opportunity for us to regroup, because we've been getting requests for presentations and requests for workshops literally from all over Turtle Island. Every region of the US, First Nations in Canada, and just very recently a proposal from Mexico, which is absolutely cool, but there's only so many of us to go around, and we all have, or most of us have, other work responsibilities that we're engaged with. So we had to really think about where we go forward in this pandemic. Well, it's been absolutely terrible, gave us the opportunity to do that. So for that, we are actually thankful. So we're thinking about things like training the trainer and bringing more people in as instructors for our workshops. Planning for resumption of in-person workshops when we can do them, because one of the things that we found over this year is that trying to translate a tribal adaptation menu workshop into a virtual format really just doesn't work. So looking at more workshops, bringing more people in, and then moving into planning for different topics. So Hannah mentioned the Master Naturalist program, infrastructure planning, disaster preparedness planning, also community health, and other areas, because climate change is going to have an impact on everything we do. And what we found is a lot of the strategies and tactics in the menu, while they're designed for our natural resources, our culturally important beings and species, they do translate into other areas. So that's really the end of our presentation. Our contact information is on the screen, and we'd be happy to talk to anybody that's interested in the menu. Typically, when we do workshops, they are hosted by an Indigenous community. We have to have people from the community in the room, because particularly when we're working with non-tribal partner agencies, it's a perspective shift and a culture shift that takes place over that 2.5 days. And the people in the room need that experience and that guidance. So at this point, we would be happy to take any questions that folks have, or expand on any of the topics that we've already covered. And other than that, I'd like to say, miigwech, you bizendawieg, thank you for listening to us.
Okay, and thank you all. Thank you, Rob, Hannah, and Sarah. That was fantastic. First question we have is, when will you be holding more workshops?
I can jump in there. I kind of answered it a little bit. As I said, workshops don't translate well to the virtual environment. So until we can get together with folks in person and be safe, the workshops are on hold, hopefully by middle to end of 2021. That's what we're hoping for.
Okay. Next question, what kind of resources can you recommend if people are trying to get information on where to get funding for projects?
Yeah, I think that's a very big question. It really depends on the project that you're working on. You know, things like infrastructure can be funded from, you know, FEMA, other projects, you know, looking at the various different funding sources. My work as a liaison, I work with the BIA as well, and we do have a BIA grant, the Tribal Resilience Program, that does help with projects as well, and developing those. So that could be one funding source. Fish and Wildlife has some funding. It really depends though, because I'm more familiar, you know, with some of the funding that's more particular to, you know, the upper Midwest. There are more than likely, you know, funding sources that I'm not aware of further south. So when it comes to funding, it just takes some research to see, you know, where those funds can come from, what partners you might be looking to work with. The Climate Adaptation Science Centers, they're all a little bit different, but some of them have RFPs as well that you can go for funding with partners to work on projects, things like that. I don't know if Rob or Hannah, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll add that the Wildlife Conservation Society has a climate adaptation fund that has, I think that's a fairly new funding source, but that's another one you could look up.
Okay. Next question, can you provide the slides from your presentation for individuals who attended today and would like to use them?
Yeah, we can definitely do that. And I can send them to you, Jane, as a PDF.
Yeah, that would be terrific. And then I will
send
forward them on to anybody who would. I've got a request from Kaya Dearnwater, but anybody else that's interested, I can share it with them as well. Okay. Next question. When they do resume, is there a particular place where we can find information about Tribal Adaptation Menu workshops?
Well, one of the places that I post them is on the Northeast Indigenous Climate Resilience Network. And I can send a link out to Jane to share with folks. I have a page on there where it'll announce workshops and things like that. So that's just for me where I usually post for those.
Okay, yeah, if you'd share that with me, then I will forward that on as well. Next question, can individual landowners trust land get assistance from you? Hello?
Yeah, the question is taking a bit of thought.
Oh, okay. It's like a deafening silence there. I thought maybe
I know.
Everybody was gone. Okay.
So I guess maybe a little bit more clarification to the question might be helpful, but it sounds like individual landowners or private property owners.
Well, we have what's trust land here. We have a lot of our tribal citizens here in Oklahoma, because we had an allotment system, have land that it is their land, but it's considered trust land. It's kind of a unique status here in Oklahoma. It's very common. So, okay, so I guess that's that question. We'll have to put a pause and circle back to that. So, okay, so just beyond that question, you work with tribes, obviously, in larger organizations, tribal organizations. How small of an organization would you be willing to work with?
I think that kind of depends on the organization, and then their goals and objectives, and whether we can bring enough people in the room to make it worth doing a workshop. As I kind of said earlier, the hard thing for us is that, with a couple of exceptions, the members of the author team, we all have day jobs that we do, and doing the Tribal Adaptation Menu work is just a part of all of our responsibilities. So we're not able to do as much in-depth work as we'd all like to do. Mm-hmm. And we have to kind of evaluate requests accordingly.
Yes, that certainly makes sense.
And then I'll just add that when we do have workshops, anybody is invited to attend. So you don't have to be a tribal member. You don't necessarily need to work with tribes. But if you're interested in attending a workshop, and we have one already organized, anybody is welcome to attend.
Okay.
And oftentimes we will have travel funds available, particularly for tribal members.
Okay, that was going to be my next question, because that's always an important issue for a lot of folks. So, okay, well, I think those are all the questions we have. If you have any more questions, type them in quickly. Otherwise, thank you so much. That was a terrific presentation, and we learned a lot. And thank you for being willing to share your slides and the other contact information. And I hope someday that we can work on a workshop with you, the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators, with our or group of members and affiliates and all that, we would love to be able to work with you on these issues as well. So thank you for your time today.
That would be really cool, and thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for inviting us.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you. And if you have any questions, specifically whatever after this, feel free to follow up with me. Anybody who's on the line today, Jane at nativebutterflies.org, and or you can always follow up with Colin as well. So thank you, and stay safe. And until 2021, we'll stay safe, and we'll talk to you later. Thank you. Bye-bye.